Good evening, and thanks for tuning in to another PhillyCAM Voices. I'm your host, Shanayah Wyche. Tonight, we have a special program long segment on emotional intelligence and cultural awareness in public health and community engagement. This is a panel discussion that brings together professionals who have varying degrees of expertise and or experience teaching and learning these concepts. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. My name is Shanayah Wyche. I'm a storyteller, community relations specialist, and Philadelphian. Through my time in various industries, I've always wondered how am I and the collective of people working with me showing up for themselves, and how does the way they show up for themselves impact how they show up to make change. As you see here on the screen, we have definitions for two terms that we may often hear in our personal and professional lives. We're going to talk through these two concepts that I just gave the definitions for, try to possibly get to the root of why we struggle with building these skills, and hopefully provide some tips on how to build all of our knowledge on them, but specifically for you, the audience, building your knowledge on them.
My name is Sara Fernandez Marcote. I'm a bilingual licensed psychotherapist living in Philadelphia as well. I currently work in a healthcare center, Puentes de Salud, as a behavioral health consultant, and I do some private practice. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Shanayah, for making space for these important topics.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm David Brown. I have a couple of roles that I think I'll probably be playing here. One is I serve as a diversity advisor to the Office of the Dean of Klein College of Media and Communication, where I'm responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I also have responsibility to the President's Office for the university on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But also, what might also be relevant to this conversation, I also am an ordained pastor within United Methodist Church, where I do a lot of work with organizations, individuals, congregations in various settings around emotional intelligence and cultural awareness. So looking forward to the conversation as well.
My name, once again, is LaToya Gates. I am a licensed social worker, a master level social worker. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. I went to Walnut Hills High School, class of 99. You know, that means something when you're from Cincinnati. People are going to want to know what high school you went to and what class you came out. I've been practicing social work for probably a little over maybe 15 years at this point. I'm currently working as a clinician at the South Central Foundation, which is an Alaska Native health organization. Our main office is located in Anchorage, Alaska. I've had like a variety of experiences working like as case manager, as an advocate, as a high-risk educator. My primary focus has been mostly on health education and HIV and youth and mental health. I spent a significant amount of my time living in Philly, where I worked for Drexel College of Medicine, and I was working at the Dorothy Mann Center, as well as the Partnership Care Practice. So I'm a lover of people, a lover of community. I value this work, and I'm very excited to be on this panel.
Well, first of all, I grew up in Spain, and I grew up in a bicultural, bilingual home. So I think this kind of early life experience in my particular family prompted an early understanding of the importance of taking on different perspectives, noticing how we all interpret the world in different ways, even how language shapes our interpretation and meaning making of the world. So I think that's one important factor in my life. The other one is I moved to Philadelphia when I was 17. And this was a move from a very kind of homogeneous society to a very heterogeneous, multicultural, multi-ethnic society in Philadelphia. And this was, I had to do many adjustments, and this was one of the adjustments. And I found myself, not understanding many social norms, feeling lost, inadequate, sometimes like an outsider. And although this was tough, I think these challenging times allowed me to develop more empathy for individuals who feel sometimes othered or isolated, different, not understood. So I think in a way that kind of pushed me into a career in social services, which I still do today. And then through my work in behavioral health across the city, I worked with people from different cultures. At first, I worked a lot in North Philadelphia with folks from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. And although I share the same language, I found that there was, of course, very different cultural norms, values, and also lived experiences. Using language as a bridge, but also realizing how much I had to still learn from the communities I was serving. I learned through that to rely on like cultural brokers or folks within the community that could become teachers to me, guides, mentors in understanding social expectations, what respect means in different communities. And really, I learned that I had to be very open and humble to be able to form positive relationships with my clients, the folks that I served.
I tend to go by when I'm talking about emotional intelligence, I look at Daniel Goleman's definition, which talks about the key elements of emotional intelligence being self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. I found that both personally and professionally, these have been skills that I've had to hone in on and develop and adapt in order to be effective in the work that I'm doing. And that's at both whether I'm working with individuals as a therapist or counselor, or if I'm engaging communities around issues that are important to them. I found that these elements have been essential to the work. And without these elements, usually if there's a breakdown in the work or if ineffectiveness is happening, it's usually related or to one of these aspects. Oftentimes when we're talking about culture or cultural awareness, it's usually it's happening because there's been a stuckness, or there's typically been some sort of conflict or some sort of clash where, there's been a misunderstanding. So I think what emotional intelligence does, it allows us to be more curious about what's happening and to show up like authentically. I live in the city of Anchorage. And so, Alaska is like 80% of Alaska Native population, and there are over like 50 different groups and nationalities of Alaska Native Indigenous people here. And so in the region where I lived here, in the region that I lived in prior to here, I lived in a city called Bethel. And so Bethel has a huge Yupik and Chupik population. And so English is like English is not their first language. They speak Yupik. And so I'm working with young people and I'm showing them pictures because it's a very family-based system. And so to connect with them, I just brought in, I'm the new person coming in. I want to show them pictures, so we can start relating, because often folks are really connected and family ties are very important. So they point to a picture, it's an older man. They're like, who is that? And I was like, oh, that's my pawpaw. And there's like, pawpaw, like, pawpaw, like, what's, I'm like, yeah, it's my father's father. And they said, oh, that's your upper. In the use of language, in the use of understanding, it's just being able to be more transparent and authentic and show up what you know and have the conversation, versus being in a place where you're funneling everything you know through your own understanding and you don't have the ability to embrace or be open or to understand how in any situation that might be limiting your perception.
I think that if you have a high degree of emotional intelligence, then almost by definition, you will be much more adept at being able to have a greater degree of cultural awareness. So knowing that even being in city for as long as I have been, I've had to learn other cultures, because particularly the dominant culture, because I've had to maintain the authenticity of who I am as a person who identifies as African American and male of a certain age from a certain time frame, while also having to navigate in various settings, which kind of gets to your second question, that are more likely and more often than not dominated by white, people who identify as white and predominantly male in terms of the leadership structure. So it has become very much not just a survival, but a tool for success. I happen to work in an academic setting, but I also maintain a fairly robust public relations practice. So I'm in a lot of corporations, as well as being a pastor. Being able to kind of navigate all those three things requires a certain degree of strength, knowing different cultures, knowing when to switch on to one culture, when to switch off of another, knowing how things are interpreted, knowing when things are interpreted differently, and being able to really come through with those things with some successful outcome.
One misconception is that a training can solve the problem or the deficit in an organization, and that is just absolutely not true. And I think something that is very important when we think about enhancing these two things in our organizations, in ourselves, is that it's a process. And yes, maybe there's a training component, but even more importantly, I think there's coaching, there's supervision, there's peer mentorship, there's maybe learning communities where we can share about our learning experiences, our challenges.
There's some wonderful things that are out there in terms of trainings, some great books, great authors, great discussions, podcasts and TED Talks that can really help. But I think that if someone is already willing, then it provides a much more meaningful on-ramp. But if someone is resistant, then it becomes something that they feel they have to kind of check the box that, yes, I've done that, and that now I'm proficient, if you will. And that takes a lifetime.
Every environment has its own sort of custom, and it has its own tradition, and it has its way, its relationship. Well, people have their relationship with the environment, and that environment has had its relationship with people. So I think understanding that, like in Alaska, there's been a lot of historical trauma. Like there's indigenous people here who have dealt with horrendous systemic, social, racial, types of injustice. And so entering an environment without an awareness of what the people or what that environment has gone through, I think creates sort of a deficit, and it's going to be an automatic breakdown and blind spot in a relationship. And so I think having emotional intelligence allows me and anyone entering the environment to be more curious versus being fixed versus showing up as an expert. You kind of show up automatically as a student who's open to learn and being curious, and know that you're going into an environment. These are like core concepts of community, organization, and leadership, that there are already leaders and solutions and attributes in that environment, and you show up to seek that versus showing up to deliver. And so I think that's just really important when we're talking about people's cultures. It's their understanding of the environment as like the leaders, as the people who've been there for hundreds and thousands of years, and who have solutions and who have experiences in that environment. How that shows up in present day in their lives, how that might be present in an appointment or interaction or in our environment that we create, like how we create space, how those things might be triggering from someone who who's had a traumatic experience dealing with systems, or having someone from the outside even come in when they've seen historically how outsiders have typically not come in with solutions, that have been impactful for them and their people and their families. And so it's sort of like, I think, a much more individual, but a more human understanding to the work. It brings the humanity in. I definitely can relate to, I don't have the experience that the indigenous folks here being connected to land, but I definitely can understand some of the health disparities that plague their communities, some of the things that have torn their families apart, and so being able to connect around those things, but also being able to learn where there's blind spots. Living in this part of the world has definitely been a crash course in emotional intelligence. I have a lot of blind spots. I mean, there aren't Tlingit and Haida people in the urbans that I'm aware of. Like, it's a culture that's outside of something that that I've experienced. So being here, being respectful and understanding that it's humbling. And I think maybe that's why folks can be resistant, because it is a humbling thing. You have to not know, you have to be new, you have to be a student. You don't get to show up as an expert. It's first day of school. When we're talking about the professional field or public health, that limited perception starts trickling down to lack of access to services, or not being able to form the type of relationships that give folks the necessary services that they need. I think it fosters into breakdown of teams and ultimately like inefficiency. So I think that's where the emotional intelligence piece, I think, is very key to being able to show up authentically, being able to understand that change can happen, and knowing that it once starts at the individual level. So it's not an external thing. Other people don't need to adapt and change. It kind of puts ownership, I think, on the individual to increase their flexibility so that they can embrace and adapt change as it comes.
It is a very important investment in any team. I think, emotional intelligence affects how we relate to others, how we manage conflict, how we manage our own emotional state and productivity and motivation. And effective leaders that are emotionally intelligent can give helpful feedback. They can harness diversity. They can see people's strengths and allow them experiences to maximize those or to put them to use, and effectively build healthy teams. The piece of authenticity and folks being able to show up to their workplace and do their jobs as their authentic selves, I think is definitely something I've experienced as not being comfortable doing that, and also being comfortable, so in different work environments. And I've also seen when people can bring their authentic full selves to work, how much more they can contribute.
There is some pretty cool data that says it talks about how emotional intelligence and cultural awareness does help one, to build the skills that are necessary for providing cross-cultural care, how it allows folks to engage in appropriate cross-cultural interactions. It increases health outcomes for the people being served. It increases the emotional flexibility for the folks that are serving them. It also, high levels of emotional intelligence are linked to reducing persistent and pervasive health disparities related to access of care. It also shows that, the communities and the folks that are being served, that when they're working with providers who have a high level of emotional intelligence, they are reporting an increased awareness and appreciation for culture. They feel appreciated, and there's also an increase in utilization of their services and a reduction in overutilization. So it's time effective, it's cost effective, and it just feels better. And it's also a way to reduce poor treatment of individuals, lack of trust for providers, to reduce stereotypes, and to decrease stigma. And so some of this there's an article, it's Drame and Carthon, it's 2021, and it's talking about the association between students and emotional intelligence and cultural awareness amongst pharmacy students.
My dean has this great saying. It's not an original saying, but I think it's one that could be operative here, is that we try to understand so we can be understood. So I think that if you can have that degree of curiosity and that healthy, I'm always so encouraged by when someone says, I really want to talk to you about X, things that are happening, the unfortunate shooting that happened the unfortunate happened in Buffalo, what happened even January 6th. There's so many things that are in our news cycle. Unfortunately, they most of them have a violent denominator. But if we don't start talking about some of these things, or we don't feel safe to talk about these things, we'll never know whether or not that investment is something that needs to happen, when it needs to happen, and how much it needs to happen.
I think oftentimes we see people burn out or leave their jobs or have to take absences because they haven't seen the early cues or red flags that they're starting not to do well, that they're overworking, that they're not resting, that they're not engaging in activities that replenish them or they bring them joy. They are stress relievers. So again, like knowing oneself and knowing one's own red flags. Okay, so I think that's one part. The other part of the self-awareness too is like, you know, making sure we know what helps us stay well, and making sure that we are planning, that we're holding ourselves accountable and our coworkers accountable to do what they can to stay well, to stay healthy, to relax, and to be able to do the best work they can. Because when we're not well, we don't do good work. When we're not well, our clients, our patients will suffer. So it's not a selfish thing to do. It's actually a selfless thing to do, to take care of one's self.
One, you know, find someone who you feel safe talking to. I think that a lot of times we don't, and because of some of the work that I do, I've kind of been trained to kind of listen for what's going on in people's lives. And sometimes we just need to be listened to, not always dispensing advice. So I think that that's critically important as well. And I think the other thing too is don't be afraid. Take this first step. I think that particularly in communities of color, behavioral health is often like, oh, taboo. Don't, you know, that something's wrong with you. No, this is all about mental wellness, not mental illness. So I think being able to be better, able to, you know, check yourself to make sure that you are okay and kind of dispense the notion of being gritty and getting through it and everything else. This is tough, just being who we are, regardless of the jobs and positions that we hold. So we need to be able to be more kind to ourselves and give ourselves a little grace.
Building relationship is essential to providing sort of care and service in this work. And so what that means is that just when a crisis or trauma occurs, whether it's in infancy, when you're forming relationships, or whether it's in the workplace, I think that emotional intelligence provides us with the opportunity to, one, identify, express, and acknowledge that something has occurred, and it allows us to generate the type of safety that's needed for that repair work to be done. So I think emotional intelligence creates that platform, or creates an environment of safety. Safety meaning where people can be really authentic and really acknowledge sort of their blind spots and begin to do the work.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. Look out in the coming months for stories from the second round of Community Reporting Fellows. You can also watch our show on YouTube and Roku, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at PhillyCAM Voices. We'll see you next time.